Good evening, my friends. Let me take you back to March 2023. Imagine a scene that feels almost biblical. A young captain, not yet 35, standing before his people in the sweltering heat of Ouagadougou. His uniform pressed, his voice steady, but his words, so shocking, so improbable, that even his own advisors whispered he had gone mad. That captain was Ibrahim Traoré, and his command was this: Burkina Faso would plant 5 million grapevines at the very edge of the desert. Not sorghum, not millet, not maize. Grapes. Now pause for a moment. Grapes in the Sahel? A land where annual rainfall barely reaches 600 millimeters, where crops fail every 3 years, and where the Sahara swallows 100,000 hectares of farmland every single year. Grapes here sound like planting palm trees in Alaska. The very idea stunned the room into silence. Elders shook their heads. Farmers muttered in disbelief. Foreign commentators laughed outright. A French columnist sneered, "Burkina Faso does not need wine, it needs bread." An American analyst called it fantasy viticulture. But Traoré was not simply talking about fruit, he was talking about sovereignty. He told his cabinet, "If we cannot hold the desert, we cannot hold our nation." He framed each vine as a soldier, each root as a defender, each hectare as a wall of life against the sands. For him, it was not only agriculture, it was survival. It was destiny. And so, here lies the question, the one that echoes far beyond Burkina Faso into the very conscience of Africa, and even into our own American history. Was this madness, or was this vision? Could a nation truly defend itself not with bullets or bombs, but with vines and roots? Or was this gamble nothing more than a mirage shimmering at the desert's edge? When Captain Ibrahim Traoré walked to the podium that March afternoon in Ouagadougou, the crowd expected the usual speech about security, about defending the nation against insurgents, about foreign relations. Instead, what they heard was something entirely different. A declaration that Burkina Faso would plant not 5,000, not 50,000, but 5 million grapevines along the shifting frontier where the Sahara pushes relentlessly south. The hall fell silent. Ministers shifted uneasily in their seats. Farmers in the back whispered in disbelief. Grapes were not part of the Sahel's vocabulary. This was a land where even millet, a hardy grain, fails 1 year out of 3, and yet Traoré pressed forward. He reminded the nation that the Sahara consumes 100,000 hectares of farmland every year. That is the equivalent of 200,000 football fields disappearing into sand, year after year. Over the past 2 decades, nearly 20% of Burkina Faso's farmland has vanished. For a country where agriculture still represents 30% of national GDP, and more than 40% of the population lives below the poverty line, this was not just a statistic. It was a death sentence. Traoré's words cut through the disbelief. If we cannot stop the desert, we cannot stop the collapse of our nation. But if we dare, we can build a wall of life. He was not offering his people a farming experiment. He was offering them a new front line. The scale of his plan was staggering. 5 million vines would cover 50,000 hectares, an area larger than Los Angeles. The cost? At least $60 million for seedlings, trellises, and irrigation kits. For a nation whose defense budget barely surpassed $400 million, this was not merely an agricultural program, it was a national mobilization. The reactions came quickly. State radio reported skepticism in villages. Elders asked how grapes could survive when even millet withered. Mothers wondered aloud why money was being spent on vineyards when children still lacked rice. International observers were merciless. A French journalist scoffed, "Burkina Faso does not need wine, it needs bread." An American analyst dismissed the idea as fantasy viticulture, predicting it would collapse within a season. But not everyone mocked. Environmental experts admitted that grapevines, with roots capable of drilling 5 meters into the earth, could anchor the fragile soil in ways cereals never could. Satellite images revealed scars of desertification creeping across the frontier, long streaks of sand cutting into once fertile fields. If even 20% of the vines survived, they said, the project could slow erosion across hundreds of kilometers. Among ordinary Burkinabe, reactions were more complex. Yes, there was laughter, jokes about wines of the Sahel, and memes of Bordeaux bottles relabeled with Ouagadougou brands. But beneath the humor was something more serious: pride. For decades, their country had been painted as a victim, defined by hunger and instability. Now, here was a leader daring to imagine grapes where the world saw only sand. Traore capitalized on that spark. He called on every household to plant at least one vine. Schools were instructed to teach children the basics of viticulture. The army was ordered to trade rifles for shovels, digging trenches and laying irrigation lines. Women's cooperatives were given nurseries and told to raise seedlings as if they were children. On national television, Traore declared, "This is our new front line. A front line of roots against the sands. A front line of dignity against despair." The gamble had begun. Soldiers, students, farmers, and women bent over the soil, pressing fragile vines into the ground, watering them carefully, tying them to trellises under the scorching sun. State television broadcast every image: soldiers carrying buckets, children singing Vineyard songs, women smiling as they lifted baskets of seedlings. It was more than farming. It was theater. It was psychology. And yet, even in those first weeks, the question that hung over the nation was simple, sharp, and unavoidable. Could this work? Could a country already struggling to feed its people divert scarce resources into vineyards? Or was this project destined to become another chapter in Africa's long history of failed development experiments? For Burkina Faso, and for Africa as a whole, the stakes could not have been higher. The gamble that began with fanfare quickly collided with the harshness of reality. Within weeks of the first seedlings being planted, voices of doubt grew louder, echoing from village courtyards to international newsrooms. A French columnist mocked the initiative as viticulture for dreamers. An American policy analyst wrote that Traore was wasting scarce funds on fantasy grapes, while his people still begged for rice. The ridicule cut deep. Burkina Faso, one of the poorest nations on earth, had suddenly become the punchline of dinner conversations in Paris and Washington. Yet, while commentators sneered, something unexpected began to unfold. 6 months into the project, satellite imagery from the European Space Agency revealed faint but visible strips of green along the Sahel frontier. Where the vines had taken hold, winds dropped by 15%. Soil temperature beneath the canopy measured 2 to 3 degrees cooler than the barren land around it. For the first time in decades, the desert's advance showed signs of hesitation. Inside Burkina Faso, the reactions were visceral. In the village of Zenari, an elder named Yakuba stood by the rows of vines and shook his head. "Millet has fed us for centuries," he said. "Now millet fails. If millet cannot survive, how will these grapes live?" His skepticism reflected the fear of many, that the effort would waste not just money, but hope itself. But others found themselves stirred. In Kaya, a herder named Suleiman looked at the rows of seedlings and declared, "If these vines survive, we survive. Every root is a fence against the desert. Every leaf is a promise we are not finished." For him, the vineyard was not agriculture. It was defiance. His children, who once dreamed only of leaving for the city, began talking of planting. The government seized on such stories. National radio broadcast farmers' pledges to defend our vines like soldiers. Schools organized poetry contests where children wrote verses about grapes as shields of hope. In Ouagadougou, murals appeared overnight. Green vines twisting into the outline of Africa, painted as chains binding the desert. The vineyards had become more than rows of plants. They had become symbols. Then came the crisis. A leaked report from the Ministry of Agriculture revealed a stunning failure. 62% of the imported drip irrigation kits had collapsed under the brutal Sahel sun. Plastic pipes had turned brittle, valves had snapped, pumps stalled. In village after village, rows of seedlings wilted into lifeless sticks. The numbers were devastating. Out of 5 million vines, nearly 2 million were already dead. International media pounced. A French newspaper declared the experiment the Vineyard of illusions. Development agencies that had once stayed silent now wagged their fingers. "We warned this would fail," said a UN agronomist, noting that each hectare of vines could demand 2,000 cubic meters of water per year, water that many villages already lacked. Panic spread. Was the Vineyard project collapsing before it had even begun? In Ouagadougou's markets, rumors multiplied. Some whispered that the vines were only a political theater to distract from insecurity. Others said foreign investors were secretly waiting to swoop in and take over if the experiment failed. Soldiers grumbled that funds should have gone to weapons, not trellises. Even loyal supporters began to falter. Pride was one thing, but survival was another. And yet, amid the despair, something remarkable happened. Local agronomists revived an ancient technique, the clay pot irrigation system. Instead of fragile imported tubes, farmers buried porous clay jars beside the seedlings, filling them with water that seeped slowly into the soil. It was a method older than the Sahara itself, rediscovered in desperation. Each pot cost $2, compared to $15 for imported kits. And unlike plastic, clay endured the sun. Children helped bury the jars. Women's cooperatives crafted them in village kilns. Soldiers who once strung pipes now dug pits for pots. It was a mobilization not of foreign technology, but of ancestral knowledge. And slowly, survival rates began to climb again. By the start of the next rainy season, agronomists reported that 48% of the original vines remained alive, about 2.4 million plants. Less than Traore had promised, but far more than critics expected. Along the frontier, fragile but undeniable strips of green now stretched for kilometers. Wind erosion slowed. Soil cooled. Even patches of grass began to return in the shade of the vines. For the first time, foreign media shifted tone. The BBC ran a segment titled "Wine at the Edge of the Sahara." Al Jazeera aired footage of Burkina Faso women singing as they tied vines to trellises. In Paris, diaspora students hosted a mock wine tasting, lifting glasses of grape juice labeled "First Vintage of Sovereignty." The psychological impact was immense. For decades, Burkina Faso had been portrayed as a land of coups, hunger, and drought. Now it was portrayed as daring, imaginative, even rebellious. Songs called the vines green soldiers. Children nicknamed them roots of hope. What began as a gamble was turning into an identity. Still, the question remained, even if 2.4 million vines survived, could a nation barely feeding itself afford the millions required to sustain them? Was this truly a foundation for sovereignty, or a fragile dream destined to collapse under the weight of drought and cost? By the second year of the Vineyard experiment, the project was no longer just about grapes. It had begun to reshape the social fabric of Burkina Faso. Where once families measured wealth by goats or sacks of millet, some now spoke of vines and raisins. The shift was subtle but profound, redefining identity from subsistence survival toward pride in production. Economically, the numbers started to speak. A hectare of millet yields about 1 ton of grain, worth roughly $300 on the local market. A hectare of mature grapevines, even under Sahel conditions, could produce up to 6 tons. Half of that, dried into raisins, could fetch over $1,000 per ton in regional markets. Even after factoring in irrigation and labor costs, the returns were staggering, nearly 20 times the value of millet. For the first time, farmers glimpsed the possibility of true profit from their land, not just survival. Women became the backbone of this transformation. Traore had insisted that cooperatives of women manage the first nurseries. raising seedlings as though they were children. When the first small harvest arrived, those same cooperatives pioneered raisin drying, grape jam, and even early batches of juice. In the village of Peno, one mother of 4 named Mariam held up a jar of jam labeled Dubina and declared, "Before, we worked to survive. Now, we work for pride." Her cooperative went on to sell 20,000 jars in local markets, generating over $250,000 in revenue. It was not charity, it was commerce. Commerce owned by the community. The political consequences were just as dramatic. For decades, Burkina Faso's story on the world stage had been one of dependency. Foreign aid, foreign companies, foreign solutions. Traore flipped that script. Every vine became a metaphor for sovereignty. School children sang songs about grapes of freedom. Street murals showed vines curling around the desert as if to choke it back. The army planted seedlings on live television, rifles slung across their backs, spades in hand. It was theater, yes, but theater with teeth. The message was unmistakable. Burkina Faso would no longer be defined by pity. At the same time, this agricultural gamble exposed political tensions. Opposition figures whispered that funds meant for defense had been wasted on grapes. Some soldiers muttered that while they dug trenches, insurgents remained in the bush. Development agencies worried that the vineyard was draining precious water from communities already struggling. The leaked report of irrigation failures became a rallying cry for critics, who called the vineyard nothing more than a vanity project. And yet, the public mood told a different story. For ordinary citizens, the vines became a psychological shield. In markets where despair once hung heavy, people now debated whether Burkina wine could one day rival Bordeaux. University students printed T-shirts with slogans like "Roots of Hope" and "Wine of the Sahel." Even skeptics could not deny that the vineyard had ignited conversation and imagination in a nation long suffocated by defeatism. Internationally, the vineyard sparked ripples across the Sahel. Mali dispatched agronomists to study small test vineyards. Ghana announced a pilot of 10,000 vines in its northern regions. Senegal's Great Green Wall initiative, once focused on acacia trees, began integrating vines as potential cash crops. Niger, despite its own instability, requested training in vineyard management. What began as a single country's gamble was morphing into a regional experiment. The symbolism extended beyond agriculture. Traore framed the vineyard as an act of defiance against the old order of dependency. In speeches, he drew parallels between the vines and Burkina Faso's sovereignty. "Millet fills the stomach," he said, "but millet has never lifted us out of poverty. Grapes can carry our name to the world." It was rhetoric designed to inspire, but it also struck at the heart of colonial-era relationships. France, already expelled militarily, bristled at the idea that Burkina Faso might sell wine branded as Vin du Sahara. Western analysts scoffed, but they also admitted the branding carried mystique. Still, questions lingered. Could community cooperatives resist the pull of foreign corporations once profits grew? Would raisins and wine remain in the hands of villagers, or would multinationals inevitably circle like vultures? The vineyard had survived its first crisis, but its long-term survival depended not just on roots in the ground, but on political will and social unity. The consequences of Traore's gamble were clear. Burkina Faso was no longer a passive victim of desertification. It was an actor, daring to imagine an alternative future. Yet the very scale of that ambition raised the stakes higher than ever. Could vines truly hold back not just the desert, but the forces of poverty, dependency, and foreign control? As the dust settled after the first seasons of planting, one truth became clear. The vineyard was neither a total failure nor a miracle. It was a fragile beginning. Out of 5 million vines, about 2.4 million remained alive, their roots clawing into the sand, their leaves defying the sun. That survival rate was enough to keep hope alive, but not enough to silence the critics. The road ahead demanded adaptation. Imported irrigation kits had proven brittle, So local farmers turned to ancient wisdom. Clay pots buried in the soil slowly released water to each vine. Simple, inexpensive, and effective, this method became a symbol in itself, resilience through tradition. It proved that sovereignty did not require importing everything from abroad. Sometimes the future could be built with tools from the past. Yet survival was only the first step. The larger question was scale. Could Burkina Faso expand vineyards across 50,000 hectares without draining its treasury or its wells? Could vines truly transform the Sahel into a green wall capable of slowing desertification on a continental scale? Traore began to speak of a vision bigger than grapes, a vineyard belt of Africa, a living barrier stretching across nations, binding them together against the Sahara. It was an audacious idea, part ecological defense, part economic strategy, part political manifesto. But with ambition came risk. The more successful the project became, the more attention it drew. Foreign investors began circling, eager to seize a stake in the wine of the Sahel. Development agencies whispered about control and sustainability. Inside Burkina Faso, leaders knew the struggle ahead was not only against drought, but against dependency. Who would own the vines? The villagers who bent their backs to plant them, or corporations that arrived once the harvests grew sweet? The vineyard's next chapter would be written not only in fields of green, but in contracts, cooperatives, and choices about ownership. The vines had survived their infancy. The question now was whether they could grow into guardians of sovereignty, or whether the dream would wither under the weight of outside interests. For Americans watching from afar, the vineyard of Burkina Faso might seem strange, even impractical. But history tells us otherwise. In the 1930s, during the Dust Bowl, our own nation faced winds that stripped soil bare and buried homes beneath dunes. We answered with windbreaks, contour farming, and the Civilian Conservation Corps. Burkina Faso's answer is different, but the spirit is familiar. Fight back against the land itself or perish. The United States sees Traore's gamble through a dual lens. On one hand, analysts question the economics. Why risk millions on grapes when basic food security remains fragile? On the other, strategic thinkers recognize something larger, an assertion of independence. By planting vines, Traore is declaring that Burkina Faso will define itself not through foreign aid, but through imagination. That declaration unsettles powers in Paris and Washington far more than the grapes themselves. Globally, reactions remain divided. European critics sneer that wine cannot grow where bread cannot rise. Yet even they admit that branding bottles as wine of the Sahel or vin du Sahara carries irresistible mystique in markets obsessed with storytelling. In Africa, the mood is different. Mali, Ghana, and Senegal already experiment with vines, inspired by Burkina Faso's boldness. Across the continent, leaders are asking whether the desert frontier might become not just a barrier, but a vineyard belt linking nations together. For decades, Africa has been framed as a place of famine, drought, and dependence. Now, through a vineyard no one expected, Burkina Faso is rewriting that narrative. The question, for Americans and the world, is this: will we dismiss it as folly, or recognize it as the first draft of a new chapter in global resilience? By now, the vineyard of Burkina Faso has become more than an agricultural experiment. It is a stage where sovereignty, survival, and symbolism intertwine. The vines have survived droughts, ridicule, and broken irrigation systems. They have also ignited a movement that reshaped how Burkinabe see themselves. From subsistence farmers to vineyard keepers, from victims of the desert to soldiers of resilience. And yet, the final verdict has not been written. The risks remain stark. Water scarcity could choke the project. Foreign investors could hijack its profits. Political instability could derail its momentum. But if the vines endure, if they grow strong, they could change not just Burkina Faso, but Africa's story on the world stage. Imagine a bottle labeled Wine of the Sahel sitting on a table in New York or Paris. That bottle would carry more than flavor. It would carry defiance. It would carry dignity. My prediction is this. Within the next decade, Burkina Faso will export not just raisins, but its first wine, branded with the desert's edge. It may not rival Bordeaux in taste, but it will rival it in symbolism. And symbolism in today's world is power. So I leave you with this question, one that goes beyond Africa and lands squarely in our own conscience. Do you believe 5 million vines can hold back a desert, feed a nation, and redefine sovereignty? Or do you believe it is nothing more than a mirage shimmering in the Sahel heat? If you found yourself leaning one way or the other, I challenge you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to follow this story as it unfolds. Because the battle for Burkina Faso's vines is not over, and the next chapter may shock the world.